Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Are Your Ratings Data Lacking Insights? So MaxDiff to the rescue, and it's easy. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Now, you're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just go ahead and select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed for you. Now, you will also have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may also send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We'll go ahead and collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce Quirk's editor, Joe Redholm.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Are Your Ratings Data Lacking Insights? MaxDiff to the Rescue. I'm Joe Redholm, editor of Quirk's Marketing Research Review. And before we get started, just a few quick notes. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording of this event approximately 24 to 48 hours after we're through here today. And there will be time for questions after the presentation, so feel free to submit questions as we go along, and we'll get to as many of them as we have time for. Our presenters today are Megan Peitz and Brian Orm. Megan is Ingenuity Ambassador at Sawtooth Software, and Brian is President of Sawtooth Software. And with that, I will hand things over to Megan. Take it away, Megan.
Great, thanks, Joe, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're really excited about the turnout. I see some of our current customers on the list, and I see some people that are new faces, which is really exciting. And hopefully you're all as passionate about MaxDiff as Brian and myself. And if you're not, my hope is that you will be at the end of this. So just wanted to give a brief introduction. I am the Ingenuity Ambassador at Sawtooth Software. Kind of an ambiguous title, but it really just means that I get to talk to each and every one of you about the great products and services that we offer. And I actually get to dabble in them a little bit as well, running my own models and using the software on a day-to-day basis. I'm accompanied by Brian Orm, which many of you know is the president of Sawtooth Software, and was actually named the 2017 Charles Coolidge Parlin Award winner, which is really awesome. Brian's been at Sawtooth Software for over 20 years, and Sawtooth Software has been around for over 30 years, and we're really recognized as the industry standard when it comes to choice research. And so hopefully you'll gain some of those insights and realize what a great product we have to offer as we go through the webinar today. So on the agenda is, what is MaxDiff, or otherwise known as best worst scaling? We'll give you a brief overview of the technique and some examples, as well as some real-world case studies that can hopefully help you figure out how to use MaxDiff in your world. Then we'll take you into the Discover software, where we will show you how to design and analyze a MaxDiff experiment. We'll also talk about how you can integrate Discover with other survey platforms. Let's say if you're using somebody else to create a screener, and then you want to send them to the Sawtooth Software portion for the MaxDiff and then back out. We have that capability, as well as working with panel providers. And you can also collaborate with other peers through the Discover platform, which makes it really easy for editing and sharing the survey. So with that said, I'm going to give it over to Brian, who is going to talk about what is MaxDiff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you very much for attending. Megan was modest when she introduced herself. She has 10 years of marketing science experience and a master's degree in stats, and she's been just a great resource to us and to others in learning about these techniques. So the motivation for the class today is that a lot of you are using ratings, a 5-point scale, 10-point scale, 100-point scale, and a lot of you are struggling with that, and some of you don't realize that you're struggling with it, but there are a number of problems with ratings data, and MaxDiff helps resolve so many of them and has provided a great approach for measuring the importance of the preference for different messages, benefits, images, product names, claims, brands, features, packaging options. There's just so many things that we do in research that involve measuring people's preference or importance for a series of items. Let's say we're talking about 20 items, and for fun, we'll talk about desserts. And we can have, hot hot brownie sundae all the way to tiramisu, and our client, or if we're the client, we say, hey, we want to be able to estimate how important these things are, or how much people prefer them. We want to establish a rank order from best to worst, and more than just a rank order, we want to know the relative metric of differences. If one is a lot better than another, we want to know it. Well, the MaxDiff approach is really quite straightforward from both a researcher's perspective and also for the respondent's perspective. What we do is if we have, let's say, 20 items in a MaxDiff, we would show a subset of them at a time in each screen to respondents. We would take, let's say, 4 of those, which we draw carefully, and the software makes that automatic so that it draws them in a very randomized and even way. We'll show 4 of them on the screen, and we'll say, hey, just considering these 4 desserts, which one would you like the most and which would you like the least? This just involves choosing. There's not a rating scale to worry about, to have to communicate, or for people who don't know how to use rating scales, who aren't quantitatively minded. You just ask them which was the best and which is the least among these 4. And then another screen would appear, and typically a respondent would do somewhere between, let's say, 8 to 15 of these screens. And across the screens, each item has been presented about an equal number of times, and it makes it so that we can estimate scores or preference scores just based on the choices. Megan, you could advance to the next screen. Thanks. So what I want to say is that from just those 2 clicks that we get on each screen, and if we're showing 4 at a time on the screen, and we could show 3 at a time or 5 at a time, but 4 is really a nice number to show people. From those 2 clicks, we learn quite a bit of information. We learn that chocolate layer cake is better than coconut cream pie, tiramisu, and creme brulee. And we also learn that coconut cream pie and creme brulee are preferred to tiramisu. We learn essentially about 5 of the 6 possible pairings amongst those 4 items. The only thing we haven't learned about in this particular question is how coconut cream pie relates to creme brulee for this respondent. But no worry, because in later questions, when we show the desserts in different sets, and we'll show these desserts multiple times, we're going to learn about that information about how coconut cream pie relates to creme brulee. The beauty of MaxDiff is that the analysis is really quite straightforward. We use an approach, and the software makes it automatic, of Bayesian estimation that estimates a set of scores that run from 0 to 100. A score of 5 is twice as good as a 2.5. In other words, it's a ratio scaled scoring, and the scores sum to 100%. So that's pretty much what all decision makers and researchers expect when they see scores. If it sums to 100 and has ratio qualities, it just makes it super easy for everybody to run with it and be able to gain great insights without having to worry about other types of scaling, or whether 5 is really twice as good as a 2.5. We just don't have to worry about it. It's all very straightforward. And for each respondent, we get these scores. Because we have these scores for each respondent, that means we can follow it up with cross-tabbing. We can cross-tab respondents so we can compare one group of people to another. If we wanted to run some correlation analysis amongst these items or between these items and other things in your survey, we can run correlation scores, because these have just great metric properties that we want. And if we want to run regression analysis or some sort of segmentation like cluster analysis, there's just super great benefits that I'm going to describe a little bit later for the strength of these scores that we obtain from best-worst scaling from MaxDiff. So the key reason that we wanted to bring you to this presentation was to explain how MaxDiff can get you a lot better insights than ratings. The ratings grid is so commonly used out there, a 5-point scale or a 10-point or a 100-point scale. And one of the frustrations with using these ratings grids and asking respondents to rate a bunch of items on that is that you look at the results at the end and you sort them from best to worst. And it's really frustrating if there's just not very much difference between the best item and the next best item, or the first and the third item. So many respondents tend to be just yay-saying the scale, just clicking top box or top 2 box the more scale points you add to the scale, it really doesn't help that much. People just kind of shift their strategy to the right. And so that's kind of frustrating. The beauty of MaxDiff is with smaller sample sizes, you can get even greater discrimination among the items. You're going to be able to see popping out which item is better than another to a much better degree than using the rating scale. The other thing that's frustrating with standard ratings data on a set of items is that the client wants you, or you want to look at different groups of people and see what makes them tick. Are they different? Is one group of people motivated differently from another group of people on the items? And with regular rating scale, because often people are just kind of becoming lazy and just kind of straight lining and not really engaging the brain, because the questions don't really ask them and invite them to engage their brains as well. They just zip through them. And so when you try to compare groups of people and you're hoping to find meaningful differences that will give you insights about whether people are different and how they are different, you're just not finding it. Another even more insidious problem that is lurking underneath ratings data is something called scale bias. Some groups of people tend to use the scale differently from others. If you're using a rating scale, let's say a 5-point scale, some respondents might want to just use principally 4s and 5s. Other respondents might say to themselves, you know, I really should use the breadth of this scale all the way from 1 to 5. And other respondents maybe tend to have a little bit more negativity to them, and they only use the lower part of the scale. Across cultures, for example, Indians and Japanese, and I know I'm generalizing, but those cultures particularly have a lot of acquiescence or yay-saying, positivity bias. They want to help you and they want to be happy and they don't want to be negative with you. Other cultures, and again, I'm painting generalizations, but if you look at the data, it will turn out that, for example, Germans tend to use lower points on the scale than other folks, for example, Indians and Japanese. And if you've got a mixture of respondents who are each using the scale differently, and yet you want to use those data in crosstabs, for t-tests, for running cluster analysis to find segments or regression or correlation, this scale use bias can really wreak havoc with you being able to derive the right insights and to be able to use these statistical tools properly. And we've described these solutions and these problems a little bit more in the Quirks article that we just published this month in July. So thank you very much to Quirks for accepting and publishing that for us. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I don't necessarily have to use rating data. I can ask respondents to fully rank my items from best to worst, give a full ranking. Now, that might work when you have few items, but especially when you get more than about 10 items, asking respondents to give a full ranking becomes extremely difficult. As opposed to MaxDiff best-worst scaling really takes advantage of the great property that people have. People find it much easier to tell you about the best and the worst things, but the stuff in the middle is hard for them to rank or discriminate among. So the way that MaxDiff leads them through it piece by piece, showing only typically about 4 items at a time, takes advantage of the fact that people are good at telling you the best and the worst. Ranking can be impractical and difficult, and if you use these ranking scales, you're just getting ordinal data. You're learning that one item is better than the other and another is better than the other, but how do you report that? How do you put it on a scale? It becomes extremely difficult from a statistical standpoint. It becomes difficult, and how do you report the data to your manager? You're going to report percent of people that thought this was number 1, percent of people that put it in the top 2 box. In that case, you're truncating the data and not naturally using all of the information that's available to you in a ranking question. So ranking can be challenging, and that's why we might like MaxDiff better. Others are used to or have considered using the constant sum allocation question. That's where you show a series of items and you say to the respondent, hey, how important these items are to you, or how preferred are they? Please tell us by allocating a certain number of points, and it's often 100 points across these items, such that You allocate them according to how important they are, and those allocations must sum to 100. Well, this can become really difficult for respondents to do, particularly those respondents who are not so quantitative or logically minded, and it just, a lot of times asking them to allocate these chips or these points such that they sum to a certain value just gets in the way of respondents being able to tell you how important things are relative to one another. MaxDiff is a much more practical and intuitive way for respondents to give you a full set of ratings for a set of items in a way that allows them to express themselves in a clear, intuitive, and precise way. Now, I've talked a lot about the benefits of MaxDiff, but it does come with a cost. The exercises tend to be longer for respondents to do. It's typical for them to take about 3 times as long for a respondent to complete versus these grids of rating scale questions. However, given the issues that we've described with rating scales, how people rush through them, how they, it just induces them to be, it allows them to be really lazy, frankly. Having respondents slow down and provide better data, asking them to engage their brains in a much more precise process. It seems like a really good thing for the conscientious researcher to do who wants to get good data, a lot of signal, high degree of signal relative to the noise, and to be able to get better information given smaller sample sizes. The other cool thing about best worst scaling MaxDiff is because each respondent typically provides repeated observations on each item. They'll typically see each item 3 times or so. We get a score, a consistency score, that tells us how consistent they are and how well they're doing in the exercise. We're going to know if they're faking it. If a respondent comes in and looks at the MaxDiff exercise and just starts clicking around randomly or mostly randomly, we're going to know it, which is going to allow us to be able to clean the data afterwards such that we can focus on the respondents who've actually engaged in the exercise and provided a solid representation of their preferences.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Now, we've talked to you about how great MaxDiff is, but you might be thinking, how am I supposed to communicate this to my peers, to my colleagues, etc.? We actually have a great video on our website at www.sawtoothsoftware.com/MaxDiff video. It's just 3 minutes long, and it actually takes you through this exact scenario in terms of what are kind of the faults of ratings grids and how you can overcome those with MaxDiff and how awesome it is. So feel free to take a look at that or even share it internally so that you can bring MaxDiff into your workplace. Next, we wanted to discuss some case studies, like I said, to get you thinking about the ways you can apply MaxDiff in your world. So we typically think of MaxDiff when it comes to fast-moving consumer goods, or in this example, a quick service restaurant. So this is kind of your standard example, right? A quick service restaurant or fast food restaurant wants to optimize its menu offerings, and it has a bunch of different categories, different entrees, different desserts, and they want to figure out which offerings are most appealing to consumers. So we did a mobile MaxDiff study to figure out that relative appeal of each of the menu offerings. And just so you know, MaxDiff looks great on a mobile device and is even optimized within the Discover platform, which we will show you, so that we recognize which device people are coming into the survey with, and then can readjust the screen size accordingly. Ratings data, especially with long lists, can look not so great on that mobile device. So something to consider when you have a long list of items. The QSR that we're talking about actually used to do a ratings grid research, but it really lacked that discrimination that we've been talking about, those clear insights compared to the MaxDiff data. And now that they're doing this MaxDiff study, they're so thrilled with the results that they continue to conduct multiple waves of the research. But MaxDiff can also be applied outside of that fast-moving consumer goods, right? We can talk about healthcare or medical or pharma. So in this example, we have a hospital that had this new world-class technological innovation, but it was a really scarce resource, and they needed to figure out how they could prioritize the message of communicating about this innovation. And they wanted to get information from very select groups of people that tend to have lower sample sizes, like patients, like their families, like their nurses, physicians, hospital administrators, researchers, even local community representatives. And MaxDiff is great when it comes to small sample sizes, and it's also great when it comes to more emotional types of benefits and things too, because it's very hard for somebody to articulate something that has emotion tied to it. So using a MaxDiff, the hospital was able to factor community priorities into planning how this research was going to be utilized amongst the patient population. Another great example that I personally love is when we think about when we go to different home pages. How does somebody decide what content goes on that homepage? You really will have to make a statement and get people to keep scrolling and keep reading and stay on your site longer, and maybe even, think about purchasing your product. And you can do all that by using a MaxDiff exercise. So a really cool application in terms of using a MaxDiff to prioritize content for the homepage and figure out what was the optimal combination. What was different about this study is that each of those pieces of content kind of had a relative retail space associated with it, right? If you think about those big banner items, those are bigger than maybe just a little news blurb on the side. And what actually ended up happening was that 10 of the top 10 ideas couldn't all fit on the landing page in one kind of nice looking way. So we were able to swap out one of the top 10 and actually replace it with basically number 11 and 12, and got an even higher value score than if we would have just went with the top 10, and it fit better on the page. We were also able to take those MaxDiff utilities and run a correlation matrix so we could see of the stuff that didn't happen on the home page, how should they be put together on subsequent pages. So really great application. Also used a lot in financial messaging and banking and things like that. But this is a different application of when consumers actually come into the branch. You see different posters and things. And this financial institution wanted to encourage customers to consider some new offerings and maybe some potential new products. So they did a MaxDiff study and figured out what the appeal was of each potential message. And then they took those results into a TURF simulator. TURF stands for Total Unduplicated Reach and Frequency. And what this means is that we want to put together messages that are going to appeal to everybody, because we know one message isn't going to reach the same customer. For example, you might have a customer who loves their credit card and loves spending and earning rewards and things like that. That customer is going to look for completely different products than maybe your customer who only uses their debit card, right, and sticks to a very particular budget. So by using a TURF from the MaxDiff results, they were able to cater messages to reach all of the customers that would come into the branch. Another example of kind of that clinical research or in that pharma healthcare industry was that we had 30 possible claims that there were for a new drug, and they wanted to prioritize it in its marketing and communication. So very similar in the sense that we conducted a MaxDiff study. We figured out the rank order and the relative strength of each of the claims, and then entered those into a TURF simulator. The difference here was that the claims were so polarizing, we saw different tiers emerge. And we had these 4 claims that were super preferred above the rest of the pack. The client also knew how expensive it was going to be to allocate funds to making these claims come to fruition. And so therefore they were able to use the MaxDiff results, but also trade off the value of the claims and the cost to their business in order to make the campaign the most successful. On this slide, I'm actually going to have Brian Orm talk about, because it is very near and dear to our hearts, because, surprise, it's about Sawtooth software. So, Brian?
Yes, every year we do a customer feedback survey. We obviously look at things like customer satisfaction and attitudes and usage, but every year we're interested in knowing how to improve our software. There are dozens of things that we can do across our product line, and this last year we looked at 46 items in a MaxDiff. We've run this MaxDiff multiple years, and we asked respondents what they'd most like to see us do and least like to see us do in the next year in terms of product upgrades. This has provided us much better data than we could have gotten with rating scales. It's also given us the ability to run a segmentation. Rather than cluster analysis, we've used latent class analysis, which is a really similar technique for breaking your total population into groups of people who think similarly and want similar things. This is broken out consistently over the last few years into two clear segments of our users. One group of people are looking for a certain type of types of feature improvements, and another group another, and there's not much overlap. This allows us, as we prioritize what we're going to do in terms of software development, to make sure we hit some of the key items that make both groups happy. We're also able to go back to our staff and say, okay, these are the top 5 or the top 10 items for group number 1. How difficult is it to do? We want to look at the bang for the buck. How much bang to there is for our customer versus the buck, the time spent and the money spent for us for developing the features. And obviously, when we want to pick the low-hanging fruit, those items that really motivate customers but don't take too much time on our part to do.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. And there's plenty of other applications. Obviously, we're only touching on a couple, but think about political campaign promises, right? You could ask people to trade off what would make you most likely to vote for a candidate in the next election, or capital expenditures planning, or employee benefits packages, right? All benefits are great. They're benefits. So if you have them rate them, then you're not going to get much discrimination. But when you force people to choose, you can uncover what they truly value. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into MaxDiff Discover. So just an overview of the Discover software. It is a web-based survey platform, so you can use it on your Mac through the web, and it makes choice analytics easier than ever before. It offers both MaxDiff and choice-based conjoint in a very easy-to-use interface like I'll show you. And with a click of a button, you can analyze your data, and then those results are taken into a simulator where you can view those results and explore them even further. So the software itself costs $3,000 a year, and the subscription comes with a lot of super cool features. The number one most important thing in my MaxDiff list would be the free tech support. Our tech support, if you've ever called in, is bar none. You will talk to a person. They will spend as much time as you need to get comfortable with the software. You can call them at any point in time. You also get free upgrades, free hosting, which means there's no cost per complete, there's no cost per survey. It's just the $3,000 per year, no hidden fees. And you also get unlimited number of surveys and an unlimited number of questions per survey with Discover. Within Discover, you have multiple different question types. MaxDiff is the one we're going to talk about today. We also offer choice-based conjoint. And if you choose to program your whole survey in Discover, that's great because we offer all different question types. But like I mentioned, it does integrate with other platforms should you choose to use somebody else on the front end and or on the back end. There are some fancy features in terms of programming as well. We allow for skip patterns, scripting logic, data piping, and you can even write your own custom HTML, JavaScript, or CSS, assuming that you know how. And the analysis options included are Bayesian estimation, meaning you get those individual level utilities for both your MaxDiff and trace-based conjoint models that then will pop into an online simulator tool. So, great news today, everybody that is on the call. If you are interested, we'll get a free 60-day trial to the Discover platform. No limitations necessary. So just email us after, or we will be reaching out and would love to hear back from you if you want to take advantage of the free 60-day trial. So the example we're going to program is the same dessert example that we've been talking about. And our steps in terms of creating the MaxDiff exercises are, at first, we need to develop that list of items and any possible prohibitions. When we think about dessert items, we think we could probably offer any of these at any given time, but sometimes MaxDiff might need a prohibition. For example, if we're talking about a fast food or a restaurant, this example is about a fast food restaurant, and we have these 10 items of what do we need to deliver on, what's most important to you as a customer, what's least important to you as a customer, that it has clean eating areas, clean bathrooms, etc. You'll notice items 4 and 5 have kind of a conflict, right? There's a typical wait time of about 5 minutes and a typical wait time of about 15 minutes. So we might consider prohibiting this pair from appearing together because we would assume that people would probably not want to wait 15 minutes if they only had to wait 5 minutes, right? People probably prefer to wait 5 over 15. So we might prohibit these items from appearing in the same subset. So on the screen of the 4 items, we wouldn't want to see these 2 at the same time. But in our example, we just have our list of dessert items. So I'm going to copy this list. Let's get started here. And we will pop over to our Discover platform. So if I go to www.discover.sawtoothsoftware.com and I log in, I will see all of my surveys that I currently have running. And I will click on New Survey to start an example. But I timed out, so we'll log back in. And now I will start a new survey. So I can give this survey any name. We'll just say example survey. And the platform will open up a dialog for me to start adding my different questions. So I can just click here on the left and see all of the different question types that I can add. Numerics, open-end, rankings, constant sum. Maybe you have a text like an intro screen prior to the MaxDiff. Terminate questions to pass people back and forth through the panel or to another survey platform. Choice-based conjoint, and MaxDiff. So in this example, we're going to just build our MaxDiff survey. And then up will pop the MaxDiff kind of dialog. The first thing we have to do is insert our items. The great thing about Discover is that you can use simple copy and paste like you do in Microsoft Word. So if you remember, I copied them from the PowerPoint report. So I just have to right-click in here and then Control-V. And all of my items have now appeared. So I have my 20 different dessert items. On the Format tab is where I can customize the exercise to be a bit closer to what I am looking for as a researcher. So we give you some example text, but maybe you want to change that. So in our example, let's go back here. We were asking people, I thought I had it written there, but I don't. We were asking people, considering only these 4 desserts, which would you like the most, and which would you like the least? Okay, I can actually use some of these shortcuts up here to bold or italicize my data. So I'm going to italicize most and italicize least. You can also click in the code and write your custom code if you choose. The questionnaire layout in this example is best on the left-hand side, the items in the middle, and worst on the right-hand side. Or we give you a couple of different options. So you can click through. I actually tend to like my items on the left and my best and worst on the right-hand side. But in this example, I'm asking people which ones they like the most and the least. So I should really change my best label from best to most, and my worst label from worst to least. Okay? So that gets our MaxDiff kind of set up, but the real power behind Sawtooth software and its Discover platform is in the design settings. So you've heard Brian talk about how many items we should ask per set. I'll go back to my slides really quick. And we have some recommendations in terms of how to choose the number of items and number of sets. So for example, we recommend asking about 3 to 5 items per set. This can change and be on the lower end if the items have a lot of text to them, or maybe are a bit more emotional in nature and people will really have to think about them. So maybe you only want to ask about 3. Or maybe you just have brand names or images, and 5 is really easy. I tend to always use 4. It's just kind of a creature of habit, I guess. But our one recommendation is make sure you don't show more than half of the total items in a set. So if you only have 10 items in your MaxDiff, then maybe you want to only show 4. You definitely don't want to show 6 because that's more than half of your total items in the set, and it just doesn't work as well. And then we kind of say more than 5 items per set is detrimental in the sense that it's a lot for the respondent to take in and make those choices, and it's harder for the model to learn in terms of about the other things that they don't choose that are best and worst. From there, we recommend the number of sets so that each item is shown at least 3 times. So there's a simple formula here where you can figure out the total number of sets or tasks by taking that number times the number of items you have per task divided by your total number of items. So in the example to the right, we have 10 total items, and we're going to show 4 per task. So in order for us to show each item at least 3 times, we take the 3, and remember your simple math from back in 8th grade maybe. 3 times 10 would be 30, and then divide that by 4. That's around 8.5 sets. So we'll round up and we'll say if we have 10 items, we should probably have 9 sets of 4 items each. Okay? So from there, after we've told the software how many items per set and how many total sets, the software is going to look for a great design. And a good design or a great design is determined by things on this slide here. So frequency balance, meaning that every item is shown an equal number of times. Orthogonality, which sounds scary, but is actually really simple. It just means that every item is shown with every other item the same amount of times. Positional balance, meaning that I would see an item in the first position, but Brian might see that item in the 3rd position, right? So we change up that position so we don't get any of the positional bias or people always selecting the top one. And connectivity, which just means that our design allows for every item to be compared to every other item at some point. And then we also like to have multiple versions or blocks of the survey, which kind of to the positional balance example would mean that I would see a survey with, you know, the tiramisu and the creme brulee and the carrot cake and the chocolate lava cake on my first screen, but Brian might see a set that's completely different. But all of our surveys are going to have frequency balance, orthogonality, positional balance, and connectivity. We'll just see multiple versions so we don't have any other sort of bias. So with that being said, let's go back to Discover and write in our new design settings. So we have said in our format that we say considering only these 4 desserts. So in my design settings tab, for the number of items per question, Discover is recommending that I use 5, but I am going to override that and use a custom value of 4. You'll notice that my recommended number of MaxDiff questions has now increased to 15. So if I go back to using 5, I only need to ask 12 tasks, but I personally kind of like asking about 4 desserts at a time. So I'm going to have 15 total tasks. You can obviously override this as well, but Discover is making recommendations based on that formula we showed you on the other slide. And then you can add prohibitions should they be necessary. Finally, I'll just show you a couple of other features about the software. If we go back to the questions tab, we'll now see all of the 15 tasks of the MaxDiff kind of populate. And then again, this is just going to be an example, but I might see this version and Brian would see a different version. And we can go into the survey settings if we'd like, and maybe choose a different style for our survey. Apollo tends to be a fan favorite. So if I choose the style Apollo, my questions now will update and look a little bit different. So I now have a different survey setting. In the Survey Settings tab, you can also include survey link variables. So I talked a bit about integrating with other platforms. You can add a survey link variable, something maybe like a QID, and say that it's unique for each individual. And so your panel provider would then send out this link with each person's individual ID. And by claiming that it's unique, that means that that person, if they decided to pause and go get lunch, they could click on the link again and restart where they left off, and it also stops them from taking the survey multiple times. So this can be used with panel providers or even other survey software. And then the only other feature I'll share with you is the collaboration feature. So for any peers or colleagues that have access to Discover, you can actually share the survey with them. So Brian at sawtoothsoftware.com. And then once I log out, Brian can jump in and make any sort of editing or tweaks or correct any of the mistakes I might have made. Okay. From there, we just click this publish survey, and then our survey will go live on the internet. So if I clicked publish survey, we can say publish, and it will be there and ready to go. And then I can click this invite respondents, and I will see my invite respondents link. So let's assume that we've invited our respondents and we've actually got back the data. I actually have a survey already completed by your friendly friends at Sawtooth Software. So it is a small sample size. I will say it's only 30, but it's great to see some results. So if we click on MaxDiff Analysis, the MaxDiff Discover will automatically create our individual level utilities and produce for us our rescaled scores out of 100. You will see that our Sawtooth Software folks tend to really like chocolate desserts. For example, the hot brownie sundae is at the top of the list, followed by the chocolate molten cake and the chocolate layer cake. I actually have the confidence intervals turned on, so you can turn those off if you want, or turn them on. With a small sample size of 30, we get pretty large confidence bounds, but you can imagine if you had 100, 250, these bars would be a lot smaller, and you could conclude that the hot brownie sundae is significantly different than the key lime pie, for example. But if I was only looking at the data in total, I might not be seeing everything that's going on, right? Because I'm a big fan of the statement that the lies are in the averages. So I might want to look at my data by segment. And in this survey that I sent my fellow Sawtooth Software employees, I actually asked them how often they ate dessert. And so that was Q2. And so now we can see the results by the people that don't eat dessert very often, the people that eat dessert every single time they go to dinner, and the people that eat dessert most of the time. So if we look at these results, we might actually make different conclusions depending on what our client's business objectives are, right? At the overall aggregate level, yes, the hot brownie sundae does win out and is more preferred than the remaining items. However, if we want to appeal to the people that are eating every single time, that might be a better option because those are the ones that are paying us every single time. And those people really like the chocolate layer cake, followed by the hot fudge sundae. So you can see in the orange, the folks that eat dessert every time. For the folks that eat dessert most of the time, slightly different. They prefer the chocolate molten cake and then the hot brownie sundae. And the folks that maybe don't eat dessert as often, not a whole lot of differentiation between their results because maybe they like a lot of different desserts, but they don't eat it very often, so they don't have a specific dessert that they always order. The other great thing about Discover is you can also add a weight. So let's say we wanted 50% male, 50% female for our data, and it came back maybe a little bit heavier skewed female. We would want to weight our data so that we actually had 50-50 male, female, and then we could merge that variable into Discover and then weight the data by that variable. So also a super cool feature. Brian, did I miss anything in the descriptions?
No, you're doing great. Keep it going.
All right, awesome. So what I should have mentioned, what I did forget, was talking about previewing your exercise. So you should probably preview your survey before you ever invite people to it, and make sure you look at it on a mobile phone as well as on a desktop. Sawtooth Software's Discover, if you change the size of your browser, it will automatically resize, and you can make it as small as a mobile phone, and you could see what that looks like on a mobile phone. So you can see here a great example. The MaxDiff looks pretty darn nice on a mobile phone. It also obviously looks great on a desktop. But again, in terms of MaxDiff versus maybe some of those other techniques, MaxDiff does really well on mobile. And then I talked about analyzing our data and exploring our results. Coming soon, we will be offering turf analysis within Sawtooth Software's Discover. So I talked about it a little bit earlier, but it will help you answer questions like, if we can only offer 3 desserts, which 3 should we offer so that as many people as possible have at least one dessert they like? So for example, I might want to choose between one of those chocolate cakes and I'll reach 80% of Sawtooth Software employees, right? But there's probably a couple Sawtooth Software employees that don't like chocolate, and maybe they wanted the key lime pie or the lemon meringue. Turf will help us figure out, hey, we need this chocolate dessert to help reach this group of people, but we need another dessert that's not chocolate to reach a completely different group of people. We'll also be adding in our market simulator, which will help us project market choices. So you can answer these what if questions like, okay, I've decided I'm going to offer these 3 desserts. How are people going to choose between them? Maybe I want a more equal distribution, or maybe I need to know that 80% of the time people are going to choose the chocolate dessert, so I need to make sure I have chocolate and all of those ingredients on hand, more than maybe the peach cobbler, which only gets chosen about 20% of the time. I had mentioned about the integration, so working with the panel company, very easy to do using another survey software tool. The only other thing that I will show you, which I did kind of forget in the Discover survey, was at the end of the survey, you have your terminate or thank you question at the end. So on this question, you can just put some text here and then people can close out of their browser to end their survey, or you can redirect respondents to any link. So if I click on this, I will actually, I'll have to unlock the survey, no big deal. But now at the end of my survey, everybody will go to sawtoothsoftware.com instead of just being able to close their browser. So this is really helpful when redirecting to either a sample provider or another survey software. Okay, and then I also showed you the collaboration feature. So that is all I have for the demo. Hopefully you are as excited as we are about using Discover. Feel free to email us at sales@sawtoothsoftware.com. It's really me. We only have 30 employees at Sawtooth, so there's no sales team. It's just the group of us, and we all work together. But we are happy to set you up right away if you're really interested. Otherwise, we will be following up in an email within the next 24 to 48 hours with the recording, as well as some additional details if you would like to sign up for your free trial then. We also offer a bunch of workshops and trainings, and we would love to see you in person instead of just over the screen. So feel free to join us next week in Park City. It might be last minute, but we'd love to have you. We'll also be out in Rotterdam in September, in San Diego in October, and in Sydney in November. So trying to cover all the ends of the earth to talk about choice analytics. You can also check out our free webinar series at the link there. And we will be offering an e-course with Research Rockstar on MaxDiff with a bit more detail on the actual methodology coming soon. So please let us know if you're interested in that. And that is all I have.
Well, thank you for making me hungry before we get to the questions. Had a lot of great questions here. About methodology and things, but I guess one of them was, is there an optimal number of items for a MaxDiff?
I'll go ahead and jump on that. Optimal is the number that you need to answer the business question at hand. MaxDiff scales up really nicely. You can use it for very few items, let's say 10 or 12 items. You could also use it if you had a massive packaging study with 500 or 1,000 different variants of the packaging, and you wanted to be able to prioritize them and figure out which the best ones were. It scales up nicely because of sample size. If you're using MaxDiff to study 1,000 items, you're obviously not going to have each respondent see each item 3 times. What you're going to do is you're going to use what's called a sparse MaxDiff. You're going to have each respondent only see a subset of the items, but over enough respondents, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 respondents, you could get enough observations on the best packaging options, visuals, graphics for packaging to be able to crack that nut. So it scales nicely. It's really open to what business problem you have. The optimal number of items is the number of items that you need to be able to investigate. You obviously don't want to throw items in there that you are never going to consider or that are garbage, but it really scales up nicely to handle a lot of different kinds of problems.
Yep, and our Discover software offers up to 30 items to be tested per MaxDiff, but as Brian said, our desktop package, which is called Lighthouse Studio, offers up to 2,000 items to be tested in a MaxDiff.
Also had a question too, what should be the minimum sample size for a MaxDiff?
Go ahead, Megan.
Sure. So like Brian's been mentioning, MaxDiff does really well with small sample sizes. But from a researcher practitioner perspective, I believe it's really hard to make claims about data with a sample size of less than 100 per sample segment. 50 is pretty directional. So given if you have about, that 20 to 30 items in a MaxDiff, I would probably say you'd be safe with around 250, 300 respondents per. The trade-off is if you can't get those kind of respondents and you really have to pay extra for them, then maybe you'll do less than that. You'll still get a really good model, but your estimates might have a bit wider bounds in terms of confidence intervals. So there's trade-offs there. But we have done MaxDiffs with as little as 20 people and as great as 2,000. There's also a feature in our desktop software that allows you to generate some dummy data and kind of see what's going to happen if I get 100 responses versus what's going to happen if I get 200 responses. So that's an option as well.
Yeah, I'd add that Megan's response assumes that that she has a very large population to project to, like 5,000 or more people, which is typical. If you had a population of 5 people and you wanted to understand those 5 people and what make them tick, I would not hesitate to use MaxDiff. I think that you're going to find better insights than if you were to ask them to do ratings.
Totally agree.
I had a question too about someone who says they talked a client into using MaxDiff, and they're looking for some resources or examples to maybe educate themselves, the person new to the technique. So can you talk about some ways to maybe, other than just sort of using it, but any other resources to maybe get up to speed with how to use MaxDiff and how to understand it?
So I would definitely recommend checking out that short video.
Yep.
Scrolling up to it, it's www.sawtoothsoftware.com/MaxDiff video. In addition to that, on our website, we have a webinar that's Intro to MaxDiff and then even an Advanced MaxDiff. It does reference Sawtooth software and our software itself, but you don't have to do MaxDiff in Sawtooth software. There are other programs out there if you choose to use them. But I do believe our resources are well-rounded enough that you will learn a bunch from just the webinars, as well as our white papers that are on the website too, that are pretty software agnostic.
Sure. And you touched on this a little bit, but just talk a little bit about using MaxDiff in a mobile setting.
Absolutely. So we have done some in-house research in terms of how people respond to a MaxDiff on a mobile device, and it's very simple and easy to do. Both our Discover and Lighthouse Studio platforms recognize the screen size that you're coming into the survey with, and then renders the CSS to be appropriate to that screen size. What we also do in terms of rating data is we actually take those rating grids and swipe them into kind of vertically stacked single selects with the rating grid for each question, which could make for a really long scrolling experience for respondents if they had, say, 30 items. So from a visual representation as well as a respondent experience, they seem to prefer much more the MaxDiff exercise because it so simply renders to mobile versus the choice you have to make as the researcher of what to do with the ratings grid should you keep it on a mobile device. And at this point, about 30%, if not higher, are taking surveys on a mobile device. So we would always recommend, should the business case call for it, to use MaxDiff on mobile.
I would just add that over the last 10 years, as more and more people are taking the surveys on mobile, both conjoint analysis, which is a more complex version of essentially of this choice analytics that we're talking about, more than one attribute at a time, and MaxDiff, best worth scaling, it's been questioned about whether they can work in a mobile environment. And fortunately, we've seen a lot of good research presented at the Sawtooth Software Conference by our users, by consulting organizations who've looked at very large data sets comparing people taking the surveys on mobile versus the standard kind of desktop, comparing the results. And it's turned out really, really well for conjoint analysis and MaxDiff, better than we had thought. It's amazing that respondents on small screen devices still are able to do these tasks very well and give us the right kind of data we need.
Sure. I had a question here too. How do you determine bad data from the MaxDiff exercise?
Right, so there, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, it's not that hard as long as you have each respondent see each item at least twice and preferably 3 times. If each respondent has seen each item in different sets and in different contexts, you get to see whether a person is answering consistently across the MaxDiff questionnaire. The Bayesian estimation will produce a fit statistic that runs from 0 to 1,000. And you can compare that to respondents who answer randomly. And we've got some tables in our documentation that show you the fit statistics that random respondents will give you versus the fit statistics, the score that you're getting for each of your respondents. And so that gives you a feel for whether the respondents you're seeing are better than random or not.
Yep, and I just actually pulled up the output from Discover. So if you were watching my screen, on the data tab, I just clicked on download data, and up will pop an Excel file with all of my respondents. I will also capture their screen size so I can see not really anybody at Sawtooth Software took the survey on a mobile device the other day, but I can also see the time it took them to take the survey. And then over here, sorry, my cursor isn't working as well. As Brian was mentioning, we have this model fit statistic. So we showed 4 items at a time. We would expect at random about like a 25% fit. So anywhere that's better than that, we would assume that they were actually paying attention. We asked less screens in this example, so we didn't have the 2 to 3 reads that Brian was recommending, but you get this fit statistic as an output from Discover that you can then use to clean your data.
Yeah, who was on row 7? They look nearly random. It was like 25.7%.
I can't tell you that. I told them it was anonymous.
Okay.
Also had a question too about just some strategies for how to get people to complete the survey. You know, how do you invite people to do the survey?
Sure. If you're referring to how to get people to take your Discover survey, if you have kind of a general sample, you would typically work with a panel provider. There are a lot of them out there, Taluna, Research Now, SSI, Lightspeed, etc. So you could work with them and tell them what your sample specs are, and then they would email out the invitation. Other times you actually have your own customer list. So you can use Discover to create that ID or to create that survey link, add a unique ID, and you might have additional information about these folks, like transactional data, etc. So you want to be able to append their MaxDiff answers back to your database. So you can use any sort of emailer like a SendGrid or something along those lines to email these respondents, and you'd probably want to give them an incentive to take the survey. There's been some secondary research that actually says using a sweepstakes offering in this scenario is better than giving everybody, you know, a $2 incentive or something like that. So saying, hey, if you take this survey, you'll be entered into a survey to win one of 4 $50 Amazon gift cards or something like that. That will typically incentivize people. We've also used strategies like at the end of this, you will know what your answers are, or we'll share with you the results of your survey after you submitted it. That tends to get people to be more likely to take the survey as well.
Yeah, we have an on-the-fly scores approach. It's a little function that you can call within Discover or the Lighthouse Studio platform. So at the end of the MaxDiff, you could show people what their scores were.
Yeah, and the great part about that is you can get to the whys behind it too, because MaxDiff really only tells you what people prefer. You don't really know why they chose it. So you can call that, hey, this is your top item from the MaxDiff. Why did you choose this? And get some open and some great qualitative stuff around those decisions.
Sure.
That's a great point, Megan.
Well, we are almost at the top of the hour, so I think that's about all we have time for today. I'd like to thank Megan and Brian and Sawtooth Software, and also thank all of you for taking your time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.